Calling the meeting to order. This is meeting number 83 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Today's meeting has taken place in a hybrid format pursuant to standing orders, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I need to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those online, please mute yourself when you are not speaking. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. If any technical issues arise, please inform me immediately. We may need to suspend in order to deal with any issues. I ask that all participants to be careful when handling the earpieces in order to prevent feedback. I need to remind members as well that the deadline to submit amendments to Bill C-57 is this coming Friday by noon. Amendments must be submitted to the clerk in writing. The Legislative Counsel, Penny Becklum, is available to assist members in order to ensure that the amendments are properly drafted. Welcome to our witnesses. Thank you for coming in a few minutes early. It was very much appreciated. Today we have from the Canadian Pork Council, Renee Roy, the chair by video conference, and Stephen Heckbert, executive director. And from Finica Food Specialties Limited, a friend of the committee who's been here before, Joe Del Ferro, the president. And from United Steelworkers Union, George Soul, legislative staff representative. Welcome to you all. We will start with opening remarks of up to 5 minutes, and then we will proceed with questions. Mr. Roy, Mr. Heckbert, I invite you to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the committee members for your work on this issue. My name is René Roy, and I am the chair of the Canadian Pork Council. Joining me is Stephen Heckbert, who is our executive director. As the third largest pork exporter of the world, trade policy are of utmost importance to the prosperity and vitality of the Canadian pork industry. As you know, Canada exports 70% of its pork production to almost 80 countries around the world. We are believers and supporters of free trade and fair trade. That is why we are pleased to be consulted on the upcoming Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, the CIIT. Depuis l'invasion de l'Ukraine par la Russie, les Canadiens ont ressenti des répercussions considérables.
Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Canadians have felt considerable impact on their exports, which has put the food security of our two countries at the forefront of our discussions. The plan of action of the Canadian government for trade plays an essential role in obtaining benefits for Canadian pork producers. As an industry, we believe in free trade, and we support the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement.
Of Ukraine's agricultural tariffs and have an interesting level of duty-free access. For the hog industry, it is essential that our products benefit from a large annual duty-free tariff rate quota that exceeds by a wide margin Canada's current export to Ukraine. Some agreements, like CITA, do not meet the necessary standards of open trade and undermines the principle of free and fair trade. That's why we urge the committee to be vigilant to ensure the science-based principles that govern our trade are protected should Ukraine ever be invited to join CITA. As it stands, the CIIT allows the Canadian pork industry to benefit from competitive access to this international market. Toutes les projections à long terme.
All long-term forecasts concerning the world demand for pork point to long-term growth. Canada's capacity to provide pork of high quality to the rest of the world will be part of our contribution to the growth of the Canadian economy. We know that the future of Ukraine is uncertain, and we are proud to support Ukraine with our government. Indeed, pork producers have been among the most severely affected, since Russia was an expanding market for our products in recent years. But we want to ensure that we will support Ukraine by providing quality and nutritional products that can help Ukraine feed its population.
Our free trade positioning as it reviews this and all trade agreement files. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Del Ferro, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, good morning. My name is Joe Del Ferro, president of Finica Food Specialties Limited. Founded in 1968, we are one of the leading importers of gourmet foods from across the globe, including cheeses from the U.S., as well as much of Europe, including Ukraine. First and foremost, I'm here to express my support for the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. If Canada is to aid in Ukraine's reconstruction, it is imperative that we foster and grow our trade relationship. However, while we at Finica are very interested in doing our small part to try and support Ukraine's agricultural sector, I am also here to provide the real-world perspective on the obstacles we have faced trying to import agri-food products from Ukraine, despite the clear consumer demand in Canada. With that in mind, I'll offer some recommendations on how Canada can address the barriers we've faced, either through this bilateral trade agreement or through some other mechanisms. Finica accepts the rationale underlying Canada's supply-managed dairy sector. While we certainly have raised objections to some of the ways in which the system is administered, we are not advocating for its dismantling. Earlier this year, Finica and its parent company were approached by a Ukrainian dairy company, Pyryatin, that was looking to export to Canada. We were and continue to be thrilled at the prospect of helping a company break into the Canadian market, since it was clear that there exists a demand among Ukrainian Canadians who are looking for a taste of home despite being thousands of miles away. Finica agreed to import a small quantity of 2 types of Pyryatin's cheeses. Given that it was to address a very specific need and a demand that could not be met through domestic production, this small quantity of cheese, barely the equivalent of 20,000 kilos, is by no means any threat to Canada's domestic producers. Almost a year has passed since the start of this project, and we continue to face significant delays, some of which can be attributed to the trade barriers inherent to Canada's quota system. Indeed, given that no additional market access for Ukrainian cheese is provided through the 2017 and 2023 Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreements or through the 2023 Ukraine Goods Remission Order, we had to rely on the non-EU reserve of the WTO cheeses of all type TRQ. This quota, which is small, already has a very high utilization rate. This high utilization rate is no surprise given that the quota is shared with the US, Switzerland, Norway, and perhaps will be shared with the UK as soon as January 1st, 2024, if the cheese letters are not extended. The uncertainty surrounding the United Kingdom situation has led several businesses across the country, including mine, to try to bring in as much British cheese as possible by the end of 2023. Unfortunately, because of this planning decision, we had to delay our plans to import Ukrainian cheese. Let me be clear, had industry been provided more advanced certainty with regards to the cheese letter and the UK's standing within the WTO TRQ, we most certainly would have been able to have Pyryatin's cheese on Canadian grocery store shelves by Christmas. While we are disappointed that the 2023 Canada-Ukraine FTA does not address the trade barriers we have faced, we want to provide 2 recommendations to this committee to help SMEs like Finica avoid the barriers to trades outlined above. First, if the government opts not to include an agricultural chapter with market access concessions into the Canada-Ukraine agreement, it should reconsider its decision to exclude supply-managed sectors from the goods remission order that was issued. The inclusion of Ukrainian products in the goods remission order would constitute a very small demonstration of Canada's willingness to put Ukraine's wartime needs ahead of the needs of Canada's thriving domestic sector. Let's keep in mind that the small quantity Finica has been planning to import should by no means be considered a threat to supply management. Second, Canada should use the TRQ review as an opportunity to revise its quota allocation and administration policy to ensure that Canada is honoring its trade agreements so that we can maximize the existing, the promised access, and ensure that import programs like these are given the best chance of success. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Del Ferro. On to Mr. Soul for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you, thank you to the clerk and all members of the committee for the opportunity to join you here today. Le syndicat des métallos est le plus grand
The
syndicat.
Steelworkers Union is the largest private sector union in North America, with more than 225,000 members in Canada and 850,000 members in North America in nearly all economic sectors. in particular for this discussion, including energy, potash, and steel.
We are committed to ensuring that our members, as well as all workers in Canada and around the world, are treated with dignity, respect, and fairness. Today, in my brief remarks, I'm here to join our voice with those who have already shared with you concerns with the investor-state dispute settlement. I would also like to raise some concerns regarding labor-specific issues within the agreement. As others have said, the committee should recommend the removal of the investor-state dispute settlement process, or ISDS, from Chapter 17. While some will argue that Ukraine is not opposed to it, in fact, they may have requested it, context, as always, is important. They are a country, understandably, in great need of foreign investment, but experience and frankly common sense shows that IDS would likely hinder, not help, the goal of sustainable reconstruction and economic development in Ukraine. It's also unnecessary for attracting Canadian investment. By design, investor-state dispute settlement process hinder the ability of states to regulate and govern for the common good, and they are expensive for governments as well. Tribunals, far too often, side with corporations, awarding huge settlements that Ukraine can ill afford now or in the post-war period. Further, in this treaty, states have no ability at all to file counterclaims against corporations. The entire process is only accessible.
Can I just interrupt? My apologies.
Sorry.
A vote's been called. It's 29.25 seconds away. Is it the approval of the committee to continue until approximately 10 minutes before the vote, if that's okay with everybody? Fine, thank you. My apologies. Please continue.
Further, in this treaty, states have no ability at all to file counterclaims against corporations. The entire process is only accessible to foreign investors. For example, from a worker's perspective, foreign investors can bring their own dispute directly to tribunals. But the labor chapter explicitly notes that workers are dependent on the state to bring claims forward to uphold their rights. This is concerning for some obvious reasons, not the least of which, for us, as the union that led and won, thank you to this government, the fight for unions here in Canada to have the right to file our own trade complaints on behalf of our members, but also in general when we see some of the recent and deep restrictions in Ukraine on workers' rights. The labor rights of 94% of Ukrainian workers have all but been abolished, including the elimination of their right to organize. Moves like these, as well as others endorsed by the ISDS, push Ukraine further away from the principles and norms of European legislation and ILO conventions, as well as the conclusions of scientists and experts. The often lauded conditions within the agreement promoting human rights and environmental due diligence have no teeth. I hope we can all agree that when engaging in bilateral agreements, Canada should be looking to improve human rights, including labor rights and working conditions. As has been noted by many other witnesses, there is still time to get closer to that goal and remove the ISDS. With CITA and CUSMA as recent examples, we know it's possible. And besides, why else are we all here but to make this agreement strong and as strong and as good as possible? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sol. On to the members for their questions. Mr. Baldinelli for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us today. And I'm going to begin with Mr. Del Ferro from Finica Foods. Thank you so much. It is very good to see you again here today. And I find it kind of interesting. In your comments, you're talking about some of the obstacles that you face for increasing trade with Ukraine is government imposed and some of the government problems. You're looking at bringing in a small quantity of two cheeses, you're saying at 20,000 kilos, and you're talking about the TRQ process, which hasn't been updated. I believe the last we spoke, and I think last time you were here delivering testimony, I believe it could have been yourself that had talked about the TRQ system had undergone a review process beginning in 2019, I think. And is it your comment and testimony that we still have yet to get to that updated TRQ process?
Thank you for your question. Madam Chair, the process did begin in 2019, the TRQ review, that is, but it's been stalled due to numerous reasons. That said, it makes it very difficult for companies like mine to import cheese due to the complexities of the TRQ allocation models.
Despite the fact that there is no Canadian processor that can provide that type of cheese, correct?
Again, it has to do, sir, with the Canadian, with the allocation model. Had we been able to have supply managed sectors reinstated in the goods remission order, we could freely bring in some cheese from the Ukraine. Unfortunately, it's been removed, so we have to use WTO non-EU quota, which is already the most utilized of all the quotas in the TRQ system.
So if you had to make a recommendation, for example, because you earlier said maybe we could follow up on your first recommendation about, you know, if the government opts not to include agricultural chapters, that specific mention should be made with regards to the remissions orders. Mm-hmm. Can you just provide a little bit more detail on that and how, if we make some recommendations, that could assist? Because, I mean, if we're trying to facilitate trade and enhance the ability of Ukraine to trade, that if we can make changes, that's something that we could recommend.
The immediate short term would be to remove the supply managed sectors from the goods remission order. And that way we can gain access to, again, small quantities of cheese from Ukraine to Canada. The second one would be a full TRQ review, whereby we revisit the allocation models of the tariff rate quotas on cheese and make them more conducive to trade in Canada.
Well, and that's the disappointing thing. You talk about a full review of the TRQ process, but again, that was initiated in 2019. What are the results of that? Where is that report?
It's, unfortunately, great question. It's stalled. It's still in the stalling process, and we're awaiting its outcome.
So we're hurting Canadian businesses, and we're hurting the ability of Ukraine to trade at the same time. I found it interesting you were talking about, you know, what's hindering your ability also to trade with the Ukraine is the whole situation with the United Kingdom and its leaving of the CITA agreement. And so there is no formal negotiations or no formal agreement between Canada and the Ukraine, and how that then leads to that whole WTO issue, and then all that quota is contained within that. If you can just give me a little bit more detail on that.
It certainly adds to complexity, and you're outlining it very well. So essentially, when the UK Brexited from the EU, the Canadian government adopted let's call it a stopgap measure, whereby the UK cheeses were allowed to be imported into Canada under WTO EU quota. This was for a defined period of time, which actually expires in about 6 weeks, December 31st, 2023. And the mechanism that was used to grant this extension was called the cheese letters. And in essence, giving importers of UK cheese the opportunity to import cheese from UK using EU quota, WTO EU. Effective January 1st, 2024, if we do not get an extension of these cheese letters, the importing model for cheeses from the UK will revert to WTO non-EU, which again, as I mentioned earlier, is the most utilized of all the TRQ quotas. We are now joining the company of the United States, Switzerland, Norway, very large cheese exporters to Canada, and now we have to deal with the UK entering that fold. It's going to force companies like mine to make very difficult decisions in the next few months.
So as of January 1st, your company could be hurt even further by government inaction.
Very much so. I'll have to make some very difficult decisions with my business portfolio and with my employees.
Madam Chair? No, I'll cede my time.
Okay. Mr. Sidhu, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us here today. Mr. Waugh, you mentioned that the pork industry stands to benefit from this trade agreement with Ukraine. You spoke about markets that you used to have in Russia and the importance of finding additional markets like the 80 countries around the world your members currently ship to. Maybe you can speak to how your members are increasing trade with Ukraine for members on this committee to understand why trade with Ukraine is important to you and your members.
Yes, the industry, the pork industry, relies on a large number of trade partners, countries, There are some that are more important than others. For example, US. China has been also an important trade partner for a period of time. And when it reverts its position, then our exporters have to look for, or processors have to look for other markets quite quickly. Every options that we open help us to be more resilient in the face of markets that are closing for whatever reason. The Ukraine would be an opportunity, an additional opportunity for our exporters. We have seen a slight increase in EU lately, but we know that it's really hard to enter into EU because of non-tariff trade barriers, and we find it really unfortunate, because if there is trade deals that are signed, they should be respected in a way that we are able to trade between the two countries, which we know it is not the case right now with EU.
Thank you for that. So what I understand is your members are looking forward to doing more trade with Ukraine through agreements like this, and so I think that's important for members to understand. I'm going to turn now to Mr. Sol. On the labor side, and our government recently introduced legislation to ban replacement workers in federally regulated sectors. The Harper Conservatives, on the other hand, repeatedly introduced anti-union legislation. How do you feel that the federal government can best engage with labor on macroeconomic issues broadly, and more specifically on trade issues?
Well, thank you for the question. And as I was saying, obviously, anything we can do to help improve the conditions for workers here in Canada or around the world is important. And I outlined some of those ways we can do that within the trade agreement. And of course, anti-scab legislation, if we can, tweak it a little bit to fix some of the things I think that need to be improved within that legislation, like getting rid of an 18-month waiting period, for instance, and closing some of the loopholes that I think remain still. That allow for some replacement workers, then by all means, that is one way that the government can ensure that we're supporting workers. Absolutely.
Thank you for those insights. And we know that for a decade, the Harper Conservatives took a binary approach to trade agreements where labor rights were always sacrificed. And I don't believe that labor unions are anti-trade, but of course they want comprehensive and progressive trade deals that work for workers. Can you expand on how labor's view of trade deals have evolved over the course of the many years, and why including labor rights in trade agreements isn't as woke as the opposition claims, but it's common sense approach to encouraging trade in the 21st century?
Sure. Well, I would say again, we're actually not, to be clear, not opposed to this trade deal. We have concerns, as I said, with the ISDS provisions in it, and think those should be removed. But overall, the trade's important. Trade is an important part of building an economy and creating jobs, of course. As steel workers, for instance, and talking about steel, which is something that we do trade with Ukraine, the fact that we have some of the lowest carbon emitting steel in the world is something that our members are very proud of. And the promotion and the ability for us to trade that on a global scale is what ensures the longevity of our industry and of those jobs here in Canada. So trade is an important part of how Canada can grow, and obviously we can create and support jobs.
Thank you for that. And since you mentioned steel production and the importance of green steel, as you know, our government has made historic investments in the steel sector, including at the Dofasco plant in Hamilton and the Algoma plant in Sault Ste. Marie. And I just want to know why the sector is pivoting towards green steel production, and do you believe that reducing carbon emissions is important for Canada and even for Ukraine to remain economically competitive in the 21st century?
Well, I mean, it's the trade advantage that we're able to deliver, again, by having some of the lowest emitting steel, aluminum, cement in the world is something that we are very proud of. Our members are very proud to produce, and is something that Canada, I think, should promote more. I think some of the greening of steel is something we have to be somewhat aware of and careful of sometimes. Some of those changes, particularly, for example, in Sault Ste. Marie, were maybe done a little bit quickly and without proper consultation with workers, and that is something that we need to make sure we do when moving ahead with any of these changes. Of course, we are supportive of the overall principle of sustainable jobs moving forward and ensuring that we can continue to lower our emissions while supporting workers and creating jobs in this country. But that work has to be done in consultation with, and actually ensuring that it's not just consultation, but also having workers at the table to make sure that those jobs are truly protected and created going forward, and not just talked about in these deals, and in the end, we actually lose workers.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Savard-Tremblay, please, for 6 minutes.
Oui, bonjour. Ma question ira à Monsieur.
Yes, hello, and my question is for Mr. Sewell. I'd like to understand your question. You support the agreement, I understand? Yes, absolutely. So you underlined the progress that is being made, because I think you can see that we're no longer in the neoliberal period. We're including chapters on the environment and workers and considerations of a social nature. This being said, we're still far from really restrictive provisions. What would you like to see? There's a chapter on companies' responsibilities, and the government is very proud of that, but there doesn't seem to be any mandatory mechanism apart from the responsibility of the businesses. What can we add to that? Yes, and I'm sorry, but I'll have to answer in English because it's not a subject that I frequently discuss in one of the two languages.
Yes, I mean, I think, I know there's been some movement and some talk around mandatory human rights and environment actions, and steelworkers support those as well. We have the Steelworker Humanitarian Fund is part of the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability, and have done a lot of work on that front. But in that work, some of the legislation we've seen passed recently, as well as in this agreement, far too often the only accountability to the employer and to the corporations is voluntary. So there's, as you said, there's no teeth whatsoever in these agreements, and that means that there's no accountability, and it means that it probably won't actually be followed through upon, and that is a problem for us.
Donc, que souhaiteriez-vous voir de plus, disons?
So what more would you like to see in order to remedy the situation, to have something that has more teeth in that regard?
For mandatory, making it mandatory, the human rights and due diligence. So, yeah, making sure that, so when you see things like voluntary within these situations, or you see simple reporting rather than actual accountability and a process for workers or those that are hurt, in whatever way possible, through some kind of legal process to actually hold the corporations to account. In the absence of that, unfortunately, it's just words, and there's no actual accountability.
Trouvez-vous justement que les lois canadiennes en matière de
Do you
diligence
think that Canadian laws on reasonable diligence are sufficient?
Aren't enough. In fact, and on the international level, we think the Canada, for instance, in the recent law that came out of the Senate and was passed through the House, should have been stronger, and should rather than simply asking for reporting, should actually require action and some level of accountability.
Puis dans le dernier budget fédéral, il y avait
And in the latest federal budget, there was a line that stated that there would be legislation by the end of 2023 on forced labor in supply chains. We still haven't seen it. There's still 1 month left. Will you press the government to fulfill its commitment between now and the end of the year?
And that is something that,
Absolutely.
in fact, I sit on the steering committee as a representative for the Steelworkers Humanitarian Fund to talk about just that. And again, the law that came through the Senate is about reporting and volunteers, but does not include any of those penalties and that accountability that I was talking about. So it would be nice to see it.
Absolument, puis il y a un projet de loi du NPD.
Absolutely, and there's an NTV bill that I'm co-sponsoring as a block member, but I'm co-sponsoring that goes much further in diligence and is not being given priority. Would you like to see it be presented in the House?
And the government can pick up these bills and make them happen quickly, so that'd be great.
Parlez-moi aussi du règlement des différends.
Talk to me also about ISDS. Do you support the agreement? We have a position in Bloc. We're in favor. We're going to vote for the agreement, but against the section of the legislation in that regard. Are you in agreement with that position?
From this agreement.
Quel danger voyez-vous pour les travailleurs?
What risks do you see for workers, particularly as a labor representative, in relation to that chapter?
When all the power lies with the corporation, so both the states and the countries and the workers lose out and don't have the ability to provide to bring their own complaints forward. That is actually a victory that the steelworkers won here in Canada to join other countries around the world where workers can bring forward their own complaints, and that was we are happy the government brought that forward. But then to not see that language in this statement, in this agreement, explicitly excluded because of the ISDS, that is something that we need to change.
C'est surprenant quand même de voir qu'après l'avoir.
It's surprising that after having taken it out of the North American agreement, that it came back in. Is there some rationale for that?
Seen it taken out of the CUSMA as well as CITA. There's examples where we can remove that, so I think it should be removed from this agreement as well.
Oui, puis il n'y a pas eu, évidemment, il y a eu.
And of course, there was a crisis with COVID, economically speaking, perhaps a drop in trade, of course, but I don't think that it's because of the removal of that provision of that chapter. That's not what can be pointed to as investors being afraid because they're afraid of lawsuits.
Again, in my remarks earlier, that there's no proof that ISDS improves the situation for workers, in fact, or the economy. In fact, it usually does the opposite.
Puis est-ce qu'il n'y a pas même.
And wasn't there also over and above the economic effects and social effects and environmental effects and effects on workers? Couldn't we also say there's a risk to democracy in putting on the same level states and companies? So institutions that come out of voting from democracy that have the right to legislate, and institutions that are for profit and that only rely on money.
Some people call these tribunals sort of pseudo-democratic, but I would argue they're more anti-democratic in that they remove the power from the people and frankly even the elected governments and put it all in the hands of the corporations.
Donc, au-delà de ce seul accord.
So, and above and beyond that agreement, you don't want to see any clauses like that in any future agreement. That's right. Duly noted. Thank you.
Until we have, the members have come back from the voting process. Thank you. Calling the meeting back to order. No, he's right over there. So all the members are here. So on to Mr. Generou for 5 minutes, please. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Cannings. How could I ever skip over you? My apologies. Mr. Cannings, 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you. And I'd like to start with Mr. Sewell and pick up on some of the comments about ISDS. And you mentioned in your opening statement that this could actually hinder the reconstruction efforts in Ukraine after the war rather than help them. And I'm just wondering if you could expand on that and what the possible risks and disadvantages for the Ukraine government and Ukraine industries would be.
Right. Well, thank you for that question. Again, with ISDS, the ISDS allows for corporations to be able to overpower governments, but gives governments no ability to do a counterclaim. So, for instance, if the government wants to invest themselves in their own infrastructure or any number of other projects, with ISDS, there's the ability for corporations to go to tribunal and declare, and go after claims, which then can actually, all too often, the corporations win those tribunal cases, and then the penalties we've seen have been quite severe. So, in a post-war situation, you could see Ukraine facing, realistically, millions or even billions of dollars in fines. That money obviously would not be available to help reconstruction.
And the fact that that we have a foreign investment protection agreement in place with Ukraine, would that make things any better? Or if we took the ISDS part out of the investments chapter, I assume we'd have to somehow get rid of the FIPA, the old FIPA agreement as well. Is that how it works, or?
Well, I mean, again, I think you could look at how that's worked. Trade has existed with under the current agreement, and the current agreement is there, and we haven't seen huge investments either way. But so it's not like we're undercutting the ability for trade, because it's not that there hasn't been a ton there already. But I do think that the agreement overall encourages us to re-engage and have more trade with Ukraine, and there's lots of ways we can do that. We can certainly share expertise both ways and push trade. I'm interested in getting some more diversity in the cheese that I might be able to order after today's hearings. So absolutely, I think things exist, but ISDS isn't the answer to fix that.
And there was a time, it seemed 5-10 years ago, that ISDS was in everything. Is there a trend away from that now in global trade agreements, or what's the?
Well, we've seen the European Union and Europe in general, obviously, clearly moving away from that. Canada has done it again. I mean, even after signing the agreement, after signing CITA, Canada was able to remove it, and we've seen that in the CUSMA as well. So, yeah, I think the trend is going away from it. So why would we now, in this new agreement, be bringing it back in? I don't have a good answer to that.
And you also brought up a lot of concerns around the labor chapter and what that might mean or not mean to improving labor situations within Ukraine. These chapters in free trade agreements are meant to basically uplift all parties to equal levels, whether it's under environment or labor or investments. So if you could just dive into that a little more detail on why this agreement falls short in that regard.
Well, I mean, so there are certainly some inclusions around labor that provide some teeth a little bit for workers, but again, with very little firm requirements and the ability for workers themselves to bring forward their concerns. It lacks the strength that it could otherwise have. So, as we were talking about with ISDS, corporations are able to bring forward their own complaints. But under this agreement, workers can bring forward complaints, but only through the support of the state. So they have to, they have to have an agreement from the Ukrainian government that there actually is a problem. So rather than allowing workers or organized labor to bring those things forward themselves, and then in the current context in Ukraine, where workers in firms of less than 250 employees have lost their right to organize, that problem is made even worse.
1 minute. 1 minute. I think I'll turn to Mr. Roy and the Pork Council, and just, you talked about this agreement as being one more little thing that could help the pork exporters in Canada, but you're up against, Ukraine, which produces pork. You're up against the EU, which is right next door, which produces pork. And we're up against, as you say, non-tariff barriers. Can you maybe expand on those non-tariff barriers very quickly and what we can do to eliminate them, or at least make sure that we don't have so many in the future? What can we do?
I would relay this discussion to Mr. Egbert.
So yes, thank you for the question. So the real challenge for us is that the terms in this agreement, if they were the same terms that we had proposed in the UK bilateral agreement, we could live with them, largely because we're talking about free and fair trade that will allow agricultural products to go into Ukraine and will allow us to sell our products into Ukraine. Whereas, the UK bilateral at this moment is not going to increase access for Canadian pork at the same time as the UK is asking for increased access for cheese coming to Canada. So, this agreement, frankly, would be a model that we'd love to see going into the future, because from our perspective, vital that we have access to these kinds of markets in a free and fair trade model. We think that we'll be competitive in Ukraine, and we think that there's an opportunity for us to do more trade with Ukraine, and we know that food security is one of the things that's a crucial issue for Ukraine at this exact moment. So from our perspective, look, if this committee were studying a UK trade agreement at this moment and it had the same provisions for agriculture based on science, we wouldn't have opposition to a UK trade deal with the same kind of provisions. So we know Canada is capable of negotiating trade provisions that will allow free and fair trade between our countries. And we'd love to see that kind of model be extended to other bilateral trade agreements. So that's why we're in support of this agreement. We think that, a science-based model that will allow free and fair trade will help importers and exporters. Obviously, from the Pork Council's perspective, we're focused on exports, but at this moment, we understand Britain would love to export cheese into Canada, but until they're going to be willing to accept pork in return or agricultural products in return, I'm not sure why we'd be motivated to allow the UK to impose the kinds of terms, non-science-based terms, on our trade agreements. So,
Thank you
that's
very
why
much,
we're
sir.
supportive.
Sorry to interrupt, but we have to keep on going. Mr. Genero, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for joining us online or here in the room today. I'll start with the Pork Council first, if that's okay, but hoping I can still get over to you, Mr. Del Ferro, on some questions as well. To either Mr. Heckbert or Mr. Roy, Bill C-234, have you guys heard of it?
Yep, Stephen, you can start with this one.
We have heard of it. We have heard of the BLC 234. We are in support of the original bill. We think it's going to be vital for farmers to help control their costs, which, frankly, if we can control our costs on farm, it will also help grocery costs in Canada. So it actually has an impact all the way through the value chain. So yes, we're supportive, and yes, we've heard of it.
Yeah, because you guys belong to the Agriculture Carbon Alliance, so I'm glad you heard about it. And trade's supposed to be about trade, and I heard that said, I think, by all three witnesses here. So it's with the context of Bill C-234, which is currently being delayed in the Senate right now, and it removes the carbon price on farmers. Would you not agree, this back to the Pork Council, would you not agree that the carbon tax has had a negative impact on food prices and supply chains in Canada?
Yes, we do agree that it has a negative impact. And on top of it, we have also to face a challenge in our trade when we are competing with other countries that do not have these kind of taxes.
So when we look at this particular agreement, which does have the carbon pricing as part of it, do you not agree that it could be damaging to Ukraine's rebuilding efforts and having similar carbon pricing measures?
If it's not throughout, it will have an impact on the inflation for sure. We know, and this will have also an impact on their consumers. So this is certainly a challenge for all consumers when we have additional taxes or fees on the production side.
And you said impact, but just to be clear, a negative impact, correct?
Yes, negative impact.
Perfect. Mr. Del Ferro, if I could, I think what you said here today earlier about what could happen to the cheese market here in Canada. From I believe the latest numbers, someone correct me if I'm wrong, about 1.4 million Ukrainian Canadians are at risk of not being able to have cheese and the important cheese from their country, I guess, in the lead up to Christmas and into the New Year's. You mentioned that there might have to be some difficult decisions made in the next 6 weeks. Can you lay out for us what the worst case scenario of that could possibly be?
Thank you for your question, Madam Chair. The difficult decisions we are facing at the moment are the uncertainties of the allocation models of the TRQs. And the most imminent concern we have is the status of the UK. As I mentioned earlier, the cheese letters expire December 31st, 2023. So either we get an extension of the cheese letters effective January 1st, or we revert to WTO non-EU quota, which is the most highly utilized of all the quotas. You now have the United States, Switzerland, and Norway in that group, which are already highly developed exporters to Canada. So that is a concern, sir.
I guess my question is, so you mentioned that there would have to be some difficult decisions if none of that, if we do revert back, what would those decisions be? And I guess, just put it in context, what would be that worst case scenario that we
Thank you for your question. You had mentioned Ukraine earlier. I had to forego the opportunity because of the uncertainty of the UK situation. If by chance we do not get an extension of the cheese letters effective Jan 1st, I will have to make I'm divulging some personal strategic initiatives here. I will have to make some decisions on my British cheese portfolio coming to Canada. And that may also, unfortunately, be a result in lost jobs in my organization.
Would be worst case scenario. Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Fortier for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And interestingly, we're talking about carbon tax, but I just want maybe to remind everyone that we also know that has been part of the agreement since 2011, as carbon pricing or price on pollution has been part of this agreement since 2011. And also, I understand in November 2018, their parliament in Ukraine decided to steadily increase the carbon tax rate from January 2019 onwards. So it's already been part of this initiative. I also wanted to add that, unfortunately, yesterday we witnessed the Conservatives voting against the free trade agreement between Canada and Ukraine. And I heard the head of the Canada-Ukraine Chamber of Commerce stating yesterday how disappointed he was to see Conservatives vote against free trade in the agreement with Ukraine. I quote, he mentioned, why would you block the free trade agreement when you know your Canadian companies also will get more contracts, more jobs, more involvement in Ukraine. Therefore, it's important that we continue to focus this study to make sure this agreement goes forward and gives an economic opportunities for businesses and workers. And I reiterate that we stand with Ukraine, Canadian workers, our businesses, by what we say, by what we do, and how we vote in the House of Commons, and even here at the committee. Now, my question goes to all of the witnesses here today. I would like to know if you would agree with the Canada-Ukraine Chamber of Commerce head. Mr. Del Faro, you want to start?
Thank you for your question. We support the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. And I think from a cheese importing perspective, the quickest way for us to find an immediate solution is to reinstate the supply managed sector into the goods remission order. That would help accelerate our opportunity to bring fine Ukrainian cheese to Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Del Faro. Mr. Sewell?
Yes, again, as I stated during my opening remarks, we would like to see the ISDS section removed, but with that change, we do support the agreement.
Thank you. And online, I don't know which one, or maybe both of you want to answer. I'll let you decide.
I'll go. We do support the Ukraine trade agreement. Of course, making sure that non-tariff trade barriers continue to be removed or outside of this agreement.
Thank you. And my next question is trying to look at this timeline. Now, if we move forward now with this trade deal, would this help in any way to increase exports, or for Mr. Del Faro, help boost imports with this trade deal if we go ahead right now? I'll start with Mr. Sewell, then Mr. Del Faro, and then online.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly right now there's some challenges with the trade. We have some concerns with some dumping coming out of Ukraine right now with steel. So anything that formalizes those agreements would certainly be helpful.
Mr. Del Faro.
Thank you for your question. With respect to dairy, unless we activate an agreement to have a tariff for Ukraine cheese, or unless we reinstate supply managed goods into the goods remission order, we will have to rely on WTO non-EU, which is already the most utilized of all the quotas, making it very difficult to import cheese from Ukraine.
Thank you very much. And online?
I think I'll take this one. We think we're cost competitive. We support free trade agreements that will give us access to markets and give us the opportunity to go be competitive. And especially in this case, we know that Ukraine is facing some food security challenges, and we think an option to have delicious Canadian bacon available to them is something that they will be pleased to receive during these challenging times for them.
I really agree with you on the bacon part, for sure. Thank you for that. And I don't have much time left, so maybe I'll ask for the Pork Council if you had anything else you wanted to add in this. How do we really continue to work with the Ukraine government and businesses to increase prosperity of both our countries?
There are opportunities. Yes, it is a country that has a lot of agricultural products, but like the United States, there is a lot of trade between our two countries, even if there are a lot of agriculture between us. So we see this opportunity as a trade opportunity where we can share some of because a pork is several pieces that are various on the taste. So some people prefer some pieces than others. So we could trade among ourselves to better find a benefit of our industry.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chair. This time I have a question for the Pork Council. Yes or no? I assume that would summarize your words to say. In fact, you can confirm or correct me if I didn't understand, but the agreement with Ukraine is considerably better for you than what pre-exists with the European Union agreement. Is that right? Yes. Thank you. And could you explain a little bit now in what way the agreement with Ukraine is more advantageous than the European Union, what recommendations would you share with us in order to ensure that pork from here will continue to have access to the Ukrainian and European markets? The major challenge with the agreement with the European Union is that there are non-tariff barriers, technical barriers that prevent our products from entering the European market, and what their nature is, for example, they require carcasses to be cleaned with specific products, and it adds cost. For example, we use other products such as lemon juice, as equivalent of lemon juice. It works very well, but they require a very specific product that comes from the European Union. That's one example. There are also, as regards Great Britain, there is also a challenge where they require tests to be done for specific diseases that we do not have here, but they require those tests on all carcasses. It drives up the cost and makes sure that then we won't have access to their market. So, as you know, there's some question that Ukraine would enter the European Union. So I imagine that would add concerns for you. Yes, it adds concerns. What we are hoping is that both from, well, there's the Trans-Pacific Partnership with, rather with Great Britain, and then there's the European Union with Ukraine. In both cases, this is an issue when we see non-tariff barriers being added. So to come back, this could be superimposed over top of that because there are two major agreements that have substantial non-tariff barriers, and Ukraine is putting you in an advantageous situation. So if that country were to enter those two major agreements, then in fact it would remove the benefits that we see in the current agreement. Indeed, it does, and I would add that with regard to zoning agreements involving diseases, we have agreements with certain countries, and we hope to have the same thing with Japan soon. We have such an agreement with the European Union, but still we have to be able to trust that it will be implemented.
Mr. Cannings, for 2.5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, and I'm going to go back to Mr. Sewell. And the steelworkers represent, as you say, a large number of workers in a wide variety of sectors. You mentioned a bit about perhaps effects on workers actually in steel manufacturing. In my riding, we have a lot of steel workers in the Trail smelter. We have steel workers in sawmills. I'm just wondering if you could comment perhaps on what sectors in Canada that steel represents that would benefit from this agreement, that in terms of investing in the Ukraine, exporting materials to Ukraine, helping Ukraine rebuild. Just wonder if you could expand on that a bit.
Sure. Yeah. So steelworkers, all kinds of industries. I mean, right from your cup of coffee at Starbucks to the steel in your car, we represent members in all kinds of industries. As I said at the beginning, I think in particular on this trade, and certainly not exclusively, but in particular, steel, potash, and our workers in the energy sector would be particularly impacted. Again, trade back and forth with steel production in Ukraine is important. We've had some cases recently, some concerns about, as I said earlier, some dumping of steel from Ukraine here in Canada, and trying to make sure we can get that slowed down. As I said, with steel in particular, we're very proud of having some of the lowest carbon-emitting steel in the world, and that is something I think that Canada has a value add that we can share to export our steel more and continue to support that industry here in Canada. So that would include for exports to Ukraine, but also, I mean, I think we absolutely, particularly with a country like Ukraine in what we hope is a soon post-war era, supporting their domestic attempts to decarbonize. I was speaking to some of the other members of the committee about that earlier today. That is something that we could certainly help with, but we also want to make sure that through that we're not facilitating further dumping. So again, these agreements allow us to support our own industries, but also share our expertise globally as well.
And if you can just maybe expand on the green steel issue and how Canada is perhaps leading the world in some ways, and how they could help Ukraine and how that would benefit Canada. I mean, these would be, I assume, Canadian companies that could go into Ukraine and help them with that process. Is that what you envision?
Well, hopefully. I mean, we're seeing fewer and fewer, or more and more of the Canadian companies become less and less Canadian. But certainly the expertise that's been developed here in Canada, and the fact that we have that expertise is something that we could gain some credit on the world stage on that. Quickly, just a note on potash as well. I mean, to remove Ukraine's dependence on potash coming out of Russia, obviously, is an important during this time, but also in the post-war period as well. And with Canada being the largest producer and our members being the ones that are mining that potash, that's obviously something that we are encouraged by, and I think this agreement would help with as well.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Martel for 5 minutes, please.
Madam Chair, merci d'être ici aujourd'hui. Moi, j'aurais une question pour Monsieur
Thank you
Roy.
for being here today. I have a question for Mr. Roy. I would like to know, according to you, what is the impact of the carbon tax on Ukrainian producers, because they still have to live with the war. So what would be that impact according to you? It's not easy to speak for Ukrainian producers. What I will do is talk about Canadian producers. At present, what we're experiencing as Canadian producers is that we are seeing our production costs rise, which reduces our capacity to provide products that are affordable to consumers who are currently living in a situation of inflation-related challenges. It's hard for me to talk about the Ukrainian side, but I can talk about Canada. Thank you, Mr. Roy. Mr. So, according to your comments, from what I understand, that agreement fails to protect workers in Ukraine. I would say at least that they could do better to protect Ukrainian workers. Okay, I'm going to raise another point. You said that you have the greenest steel, that you're green. It's like we have the greenest aluminum in the world. What is the added value of that? What does that give you to be greener? Does that attract people who want to buy your steel? Does it increase your market? Or is it the greenest kind and there's no other benefit to it? I would say that it's our steel that is the most green. And I would say ours referring to Canada and not just for the steel workers.
What do I think that does for us? I think it helps us secure a future for our industry in this, globally. And I think that but I think we can do more to promote it. I don't think there's been enough to promote it. So has it done enough yet? I don't think so. But can it? Yes.
So for my other question, I omitted to say I want to share my time with Mr. Sidak. So since 2014, steel on foreign markets has seen an increase of 19%, from 19 to 39% here in Canada. What can you say about that?
Well, I can definitely say that's a problem. And some of that comes through dumping, the illegal dumping from China. As I said, some of that's even coming from Ukraine. China is obviously the biggest problem that we have. So more support domestically for our steel industry is crucial, and that comes both from greening it, but also from ensuring. I think there's lots of things we can do through procurement. We've often stood for ensuring that government procurement requires not only Canadian workers but also Canadian materials to be used. So whether it's building bridges or buildings or whatever, it's all well and good to have Canadian workers, and obviously we support that. But those materials being Canadian as well would be a big start, and doing what we can to shut down on that illegal dumping of the dirty steel and aluminum and cement that we see coming from other countries.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a motion that I would like to move. Madam Clerk, if you would please distribute that motion to the committee. And I am now going to read the motion. That the committee recommend to the House that it be granted the power during its consideration of Bill C-57, an act to implement the 2023 Free Trade Agreement between Canada and Ukraine, in light of the fact that the Liberal government granted a waiver exemption to allow for the export of a turbine from Canada that was used to export Russian gas to expand the scope of the study in the bill in order to facilitate Canadian LNG and other energy expertise to further assist Ukraine and to support expanded munitions productions in Canada and increasing munition and weapons exports to Ukraine, and support the development of weapons and munitions manufacturing capability in Ukraine by the Ukrainian industry. And I'd now like to speak to that motion, Madam Chair. So we actually are in a situation where certain members of the government are suggesting that Conservative members do not support Ukraine because we have a principled objection to certain things that are contained within the free trade agreement, one of which is a price on carbon, which is not in any of our other existing free trade agreements, and is in fact not in any free trade agreement Ukraine has ever signed. It's the first time it's ever been in that. We think that there are many ways that this trade agreement could be enhanced to actually help Ukraine in the middle of the war. So I'm going to start with this first of all. We're being told that we are hurting Ukraine by voting against a bad trade deal. What in fact has happened is that this Liberal government granted a waiver exemption to allow for the export of a gas turbine that was used to transport Russian gas. Think about that for a second. And what funds Putin's war machine? What helps fund his war, his illegal, outrageous, and barbaric war in Ukraine? Gas. The revenues they get from the sale of gas. And this Liberal government actually granted a waiver to export a turbine to help them do it. And then they have the audacity to say that we are hurting Ukraine on a vote which was inconsequential because this bill has been referred to the committee. It's actually here. I don't know if Liberal members know that, but the actual free trade agreement, it's here at committee. The vote didn't hurt anything. We are Her Majesty's loyal opposition. We get to oppose bad pieces of legislation or bad trade agreements. When you insert carbon tax, carbon price, carbon leakage into a trade agreement for the first time, we get to object, which is what we've done. Doesn't hurt Ukraine. The deal came to committee. The deal's most likely going to pass the House. The other parties are supporting it because they all also have a carbon price, carbon tax obsession. All the parties in the House of Commons are obsessed with taxing through carbon Canadians into poverty. And I agree, trade deals are about exports. Let's import, let's export. But you know we shouldn't export? The misery of the carbon tax. The misery of the carbon tax that has put 2 million Canadians going to a food bank in 1 month alone. Never in the history of Canada has this happened. 7 million Canadians are now cutting back on food because they can't afford to eat. We actually just heard from the pork producers, the carbon tax is making pork more expensive. Why? They have to heat their barns. This can cost tens of thousands of dollars in carbon tax every single month. We should not be exporting that. So this motion, and what's amazing is the Foreign Affairs Committee did a report in February of 2023 where they recommended that there not be a waiver granted to Siemens to export that turbine. And guess what? The government did it anyway. So when you look at what's hurt Ukraine, what's actually hurt Ukraine was exporting that turbine to give some more blood money to Vladimir Putin in his war. So there's a real opportunity here, Madam Chair. One of the things that Ukraine desperately needs is energy security in this war. And there's an article here, a very well-researched article in the issue. And one of the things it says right in the article, as Ukraine rebuilds and adapts to a new geopolitical reality, achieving energy security will be instrumental in putting the country back on its feet. Instrumental in putting the country back on its feet. So, what is not included in this free trade agreement is anything on LNG cooperation or energy security cooperation. So, this motion is going to allow us to expand the scope of the review of this to include these things. If Liberals actually want to make up for the fact that they exported a turbine that helped Vladimir Putin, they can now vote to expand the scope of this bill to allow for there to be chapters on energy security and LNG cooperation, which will actually help Ukraine. The second part of this motion is with respect to munitions and weapons. Let me tell you this. Canada has not increased its exports in munitions to Ukraine from day one. 3,000 shells a month is where they started. 3,000 is where we are today. No increase whatsoever. Ukraine goes through 6,000 shells a day. And we are not increasing our exports of this. That should be something in this agreement. How do we cooperate to increase the number of shells that are being available to Ukraine? Because there's actually a formula in war. The amount of artillery shells that you can use reduces the lives you lose on the battlefield. So by voting for this, we are going to find a way to increase Canadian exports of munitions, which will directly benefit the Ukrainian armed forces and save Ukrainian lives, as opposed to exporting a turbine, which helped Vladimir Putin. And we could also be absolutely helping with weapons. In fact, it was a conservative proposal that we would send decommissioned LAVs in March of 2022, decommissioned LAVs to Ukraine to help in the war. Guess where they ended up? On the scrap heap. 300 fighting vehicles that could have been exported to Ukraine to help them in the war, which conservatives recommended, the Liberal government did not do. So, Madam Chair, I elevated you. You would be a great speaker. Look, Madam Chair, Liberals have a chance to redeem themselves. This committee a similar motion came to this committee. All Liberals voted against it. I was prepared to move a motion like this in the House of Commons on the floor today, but guess what? You had to put it on notice, so they played a little procedural game so the motion wouldn't be able to be debated today. But the rubber hits the road today, Madam Chair. Will these Liberals actually do something to help Ukraine, or will they vote this down again, which I expect they will, because they're all talk, no action?
Mr. Sidiou, please, speaking to the motion at the moment.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to put this on the record. This is another veiled delay tactic designed to save face after the Conservatives voted against the trade agreement yesterday. This is just simply ridiculous. They continue to be called out by the business community, the trade community, industry groups, media, UCC, Ukrainians, and many more other stakeholders across the board. This is something that we've heard from witnesses that all spoke in favor of this, saying they're in support of this trade agreement to be ratified as soon as possible. There's many benefits to be seen by industry groups across the board, and it's going to help not only Canadian businesses, but it's going to help Ukraine rebuild. Minister Ng was at the Rebuild conference on Monday and Tuesday, and she also heard directly from stakeholders that came up to her and thanked Canada for the support, because frankly, this is what Ukraine has asked for. This is what the business community in Canada has been in favor of, and we are going to continue to push forward with this. I don't know what the Conservatives' obsession with carbon pricing is, when these are the same folks that had this in their campaign promises in the 2021 election. There are many of their members that were talking very proudly about carbon pricing and the impacts it can have to save our environment, the impacts it can have to keep future generations safe, provide clean drinking water, make sure that we're able to fight pollution. And here you have the Conservatives frankly obsessed with something that's not even factual. They're making things up on the fly as they go along. And I think it's important for those that are listening, those that are here today, to see this. It's just a veiled tactic designed to save face and waste time. And time, Ukrainians are asking us from us to be there. We'll continue to be there. Canada's FTA with Ukraine has very little to do with the adoption and development of a carbon tax with Ukraine. In fact, Ukraine has been using carbon pricing for many years now with alignments with the EU emissions trading system. And since 2011, Ukraine put forward a carbon tax that applies to CO2 emissions from stationary sources in the industry, power, and building sectors. So this is nothing new. In November 2018, as we heard, their parliament decided to steadily increase the carbon tax rate. And so I think it's important that we put this on record that it's nothing new to Ukrainians. I'm not sure where this fake outrage is coming from, but I want to speak to, since we spoke about defense assistance to Ukraine, Canada has provided billions of dollars in defense assistance. From Leopard tanks to armored vehicles to missile defense systems, to training for officers. In fact, we'll continue to be there, as the Prime Minister says, as our government has said. But it's the Conservatives that are delaying support to Ukraine. And I think it's important for the public to see this. I don't know how Conservative members with Ukrainian diaspora can go out and speak to their Ukrainian communities after this, after they're blocking support for Ukraine. We see it, industry groups see it, businesses groups see it, and I think it's important for those that are watching today to see this fake outrage. I don't know where it's coming from. It seems similar to what's happening in the U.S. With the far right, but I think they need to actually put their thoughts on the stage, because carbon pricing and hiding behind carbon pricing or carbon tax is not the way to go, because we all know that Ukraine knows about carbon pricing. They've been using carbon pricing for many, many years now.
I have Mr. Meow and Mr. El-Khoury.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I guess it's no surprise that Conservatives is going to bring this motion back again. And I guess, for us to redeem ourselves, it shows from the vote how supportive they are with this modernized CUFTA agreement. And I think let's remind our members, this CUFTA agreement, the modernization CUFTA agreement, was discussed prior to the war outbreak. And, I don't think any of us would agree that we support this ongoing war conflict that's happening between Russia and Ukraine. And we want them to end this as soon as possible, because the focus is to really look at the long term and see how we can help Ukraine rebuild this. With this motion, I'm not supporting it, definitely, because, for us to redeem ourselves, we should continue and move forward with this legislation and make sure this passes through the House as soon as possible, so we can help with the rebuilding effort of Ukraine. And hearing from the community of mine, UCC, Ukrainian community, and Richmond Center, everyone is understanding how important this free trade agreement is, and we are looking forward to speed up this process to make sure that it's in place, so that more trade, more relation between our countries can establish and help with the rebuilding effort. And I just want to put this in record as well. The Deputy Minister of Economy, Trade, Negotiator of Ukraine spoke highly of this agreement and how this agreement will rebuild Ukraine conference in confidence, and also in Toronto specifically, that this agreement gives more opportunity for SMEs in Canada and also in Ukraine. And this is exactly why Canada and Ukraine is interested in moving this modernized CUFTA agreement forward, and how we can grow our small and mid-sized business into an international business. This is, I feel, is very important for our local, not just local or national economy, but global economy as well. So I'm going to end it at that note, and I really hope that the Conservative is not playing games, and let's move forward with this new modernized CUFTA agreement. Thank you.
Mr. El-Khoury, I know we have you on the list, but I'm watching the clock quite carefully. So do you mind if... Well, I think it's important that we deal with the issue, and I cannot stay beyond one. So Mr. Seaback has introduced a motion. Is there any further debate on the motion? Not seeing any debate. We'll read out the motion again. That the committee recommends to the House that it be granted the power during its consideration of Bill C-57, an act to implement the 2023 Free Trade Agreement between Canada and Ukraine, in light of the fact that the Liberal government granted a waiver exemption to allow for the export of a turbine from Canada that was then used to export Russian gas, to expand the scope of the study of the bill in order to facilitate Canadian LNG and other energy expertise to further assist Ukraine, and to support expanded munitions production in Canada and increasing munition and weapons exports to Ukraine, and support the development of weapons and munitions manufacturing capabilities in Ukraine by Canadian industry. Okay? Well, Madam Clerk, we will have a vote.
I'd like to request a recorded division.
And Mr. El Khoury. Ms. Fortier.
No.
Mr. Miao.
No.
Mr. Sidhu.
No.
Dr. Fry.
I'm substituting for Dr. Fry. I vote no.
Mr. Casey. Okay. Mr. Baldinelli.
In favor.
Mr. Generou.
In favor.
Monsieur Martel. Oui. Mr. Seaback.
Yes.
Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
Nope.
Mr. Cannings.
No.
Yeas pour 4, nays contre 7.
Okay, thank you very much. To our witnesses, thank you for your valuable information and your patience today was very much appreciated. I move adjournment.